My name is Evelyn Carter. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been known as the dependable one, the calm one, the woman who doesn't make scenes, doesn't raise her voice, doesn't demand attention. I work in a professional environment where competence is expected, but visibility is optional, and I learned early how easy it is to be quietly underestimated there. People often assume I'm agreeable because I listen. They think I'm passive because I don't interrupt. They mistake my stillness for a lack of ambition and my patience for tolerance. I've been called steady, low maintenance, even easy to work with. And those words sound like compliments until you realize how often they're used to justify taking more than they give. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about a dramatic confrontation or a perfectly timed speech that silences a room. There are no villains twirling mustaches here, no explosive betrayals, no moment where I finally snap. That's not how this unfolded, and that's not who I am. This is a story about what happens when you're told over and over again that you're overreacting, when your discomfort is reframed as sensitivity, when your boundaries are treated like inconveniences, and how, instead of arguing, explaining, or begging to be understood, I reacted by leaving, quietly, completely, without asking permission. I left without arguing. What you're about to hear is a slow emotional journey, one that begins with small, almost forgettable moments. Glances, comments, decisions made without me in the room. It moves through a long season of self-doubt, where I questioned whether I was imagining things, whether I should just be more flexible, more grateful, less difficult. And eventually, it arrives at a choice that didn't look powerful from the outside, but changed everything inside me. I won't exaggerate what happened. I won't paint myself as flawless or pretend I always knew what I was doing. There were days I stayed longer than I should have. Days I convinced myself that silence was maturity, not fear. Days I hoped someone would notice without me having to point it out. But this is an honest account of how quiet dominance actually works, not as a tactic, but as a consequence of clarity. It's about psychological reversal, not through manipulation, but through absence, about what people feel when the person they relied on without respecting is suddenly no longer there. If you've ever been the one who kept things running while being overlooked, if you've ever been told you were making a big deal out of nothing, if you've ever wondered whether leaving calmly could say more than staying and fighting, then maybe this story will feel familiar. Before we begin, let me ask you something gently. Have you ever realized your value only after you stopped explaining it? To them, I was dependable in the way furniture is dependable. Always there, always useful, rarely acknowledged unless something was missing. In meetings, I was the one who remembered what had been decided 3 weeks earlier, the one who quietly slid a document across the table when someone else forgot it existed. I knew the timelines, the vendor constraints, and the unspoken politics between departments. When something went wrong, my name was mentioned, never with blame, but with relief. Ask Evelyn. She'll know. Evelyn usually handles that. What they didn't do was look at me when they said it. I wasn't invisible in a dramatic way. No one ignored me outright. No one was cruel. That's what made it harder to name. I was included, just not centered, consulted, just not credited, relied on, just not respected. I spoke carefully because I'd learned that speaking confidently didn't always mean being heard. When I did offer an opinion, it was often received with a polite nod, followed by someone else repeating the same idea 10 minutes later in different words. That version would be praised as insightful. Mine would quietly dissolve into the air. I told myself it didn't matter. After all, I wasn't there to be admired. I was there to do good work. I believed, truly believed, that consistency would eventually speak for itself. That if I stayed steady long enough, someone would notice the pattern, the quiet competence, the fact that things simply didn't fall apart when I was involved. And to be fair, they did notice. They noticed when I took a day off. Emails piled up, decisions stalled, small issues turned into confusion. Someone would joke, half laughing, "We really need Evelyn back." As if I were a system reboot, not a person. As if my absence was inconvenient, but my presence was automatic. When I returned, there was no conversation, just relief. The unspoken expectation that I would resume my place and smooth everything over. I did. That was who I was to them. The smoother, the absorber, the one who made other people look organized by quietly catching what they dropped. Outside of work, the pattern repeated in subtler ways. Friends leaned on me for advice, for logistics, for emotional steadiness. I was the listener, the planner, the one who remembered birthdays and preferences. When I expressed discomfort or disappointment, it was often met with surprise. You? Really? You're usually so chill. I didn't think that would bother you. As if my calm demeanor meant I didn't feel things deeply. As if being composed canceled out the right to be affected. I wasn't resentful then. Not yet. Mostly, I was tired in a way I couldn't quite explain. A low-grade fatigue that had nothing to do with hours worked and everything to do with how little space I occupied, despite how much I carried. I started to notice how often decisions were made without me, even when they directly affected my workload. How plans were announced as conclusions rather than discussions. How my flexibility was assumed, not appreciated. Still, I smiled. I adapted. I filled in the gaps. I told myself this was adulthood. That is not everything needed to be a battle. That being easy to work with was a strength. And maybe it was, until it became my only defining feature. The truth is, I trained people how to treat me without realizing it. Every time I adjusted instead of objecting. Every time I solved a problem quietly instead of pointing out why it existed. Every time I chose harmony over clarity, I became essential, but interchangeable in their minds. They trusted the role I played, not the person I was. And because I never demanded recognition, they assumed I didn't need it. Because I didn't protest small dismissals, they assumed there were no larger ones. Because I stayed, they assumed I always would. Looking back now, I can see how cleanly the picture was drawn. I was safe, predictable, reliable. I was not seen as someone who would ever leave. And that belief, more than anything else, shaped how they spoke to me, planned around me, and slowly, unknowingly, took me for granted. At the time, I didn't think of it as an injustice. I didn't use words like disrespect or erasure. I just thought this was the cost of being competent and calm in a world that rewards loud certainty. I had no idea that this version of me, the one who absorbed everything quietly, was already nearing her limit. The first moment didn't announce itself as important. That's what made it effective. It happened during a planning meeting on an ordinary Tuesday. No raised voices, no tension in the room. We were discussing a timeline shift for a project I had been coordinating for months. I knew the dependencies. I knew which vendors could flex and which absolutely could not. When the conversation drifted toward an unrealistic deadline, I spoke up, not emotionally, not defensively, just factually. I explained calmly that the proposed change would compress a review phase that legally couldn't be shortened. I even suggested an alternative, one that preserved the deadline they cared about while protecting the part that couldn't move. There was a pause. Then someone else laughed lightly and said, "I think we're overthinking it. Let's just try it and see what happens." The room moved on. No one challenged him. No one circled back to what I'd said. My words didn't spark a debate or a decision. They simply vanished, as if they'd been ambient noise. I remember the physical sensation more than the thought. A slight tightening in my chest, not anger, more like a quiet alert. Something in me registered the dismissal before my mind gave it language. I told myself it was nothing. Meetings move fast. People miss things. It wasn't personal. Except it kept replaying in my head. Not because I needed to be right, but because I knew what would happen next. And when it did, it happened exactly the way I'd predicted. 2 weeks later, the compressed phase caused delays. Legal flagged the issue. The timeline slipped anyway, but now it was framed as an unforeseen complication. In the follow-up meeting, someone said, "There was no way we could have known." I didn't say anything. Not because I didn't want to, but because the room didn't feel like a place where truth mattered in that moment. Semaskist. It felt like a place where saving face mattered more. Someone glanced at me briefly, not to ask, just a flicker of awareness. Then the conversation moved on. Afterward, a colleague said to me in the hallway, "You were right, by the way." It was said casually, kindly even, but privately. That was the cut, not the disagreement, not the mistake. The fact that my credibility was acknowledged only when it cost nothing to do so. That my accuracy lived inside comments and hindsight, never in real-time decisions. I noticed other things after that. How people spoke over me just enough to redirect the conversation. How my emails were responded to with, "Let's discuss live," only for the discussion to exclude me. how decisions were framed as collective, even when only a few voices shaped them. And each time, I told myself the same thing. Don't be dramatic, this is normal, you're reading too much into it. When I mentioned my frustration to someone I trusted, they frowned slightly and said, I think you might be taking it personally. No one's trying to undermine you. That sentence stayed with me. Not because it was cruel, but because it subtly relocated the problem. If no one was trying to undermine me, then the discomfort must be coming from me, from my sensitivity, from my expectations. So I adjusted those expectations downward. I became more careful about when I spoke. I softened my language even further. I framed concerns as questions, then as suggestions, then sometimes not at all. And on the surface, things improved. Fewer awkward pauses, less internal tension, more nods, more, thanks, Evelyn. But something else happened too. A line had been crossed quietly, and my silence confirmed that it was safe to cross again. The first small cut wasn't about being ignored once. It was about realizing how easy it was for my input to be erased without consequence, how quickly my voice could be sidelined as long as the room remained comfortable. I didn't bleed from it. There was no visible wound, just a subtle shift in how I saw the space I occupied. I started paying closer attention, not with suspicion, but with clarity. To whom it was heard immediately, to whom it was deferred, to whose discomfort was taken seriously, and whose was reframed as an overreaction. And slowly, something settled in my chest. Not rage, not resentment, awareness. I still showed up the same way, still did my job, still kept things running. But from that moment on, I began remembering everything. Once you've noticed a pattern, it becomes harder to unsee it. After that first small cut, nothing dramatically worsened. There was no sudden shift in tone or behavior that would have justified a confrontation. Instead, the same kinds of moments repeated, softly, consistently, until they began to feel normal. My ideas were still welcomed, technically. They just weren't weighted. I could speak, but my words didn't land with urgency. When I flagged risks, they were framed as caution bordering on pessimism. When others took the same risks and failed, it was framed as innovation. I started to hear phrases that sounded reasonable on the surface. Let's not get stuck in the details. We can course correct later. You're very thorough, which is great, but we need to move fast. Each one chipped away at something I valued: precision, foresight, responsibility, and each time I nodded. Because pushing back would have required energy, I wasn't sure whether it would be respected. So I rationalized. I told myself that every team needs different types of people, that not everyone is meant to lead the conversation. My strength was execution, not influence. I reminded myself that being indispensable didn't always come with visibility, and in doing so, I slowly agreed to a version of myself that was smaller than the truth. There were moments when the dismissal was almost laughable in its subtlety. A meeting where I was introduced as support, despite having designed the entire workflow. An email thread where a decision I'd already implemented was announced as if it were someone else's idea. A performance review that praised my reliability but made no mention of initiative, as if I were a well-oiled machine, not a thinking participant. Each incident alone was forgettable. Together, they formed a narrative. I was the one who handled things, not the one who shaped them. And because I didn't object, the story solidified. I became the default solution for problems I didn't create, the safety net beneath bold moves I wasn't consulted on. When something succeeded, it was because of vision. When something stalled, it was because of logistics. And logistics were my domain. I absorbed that too. I told myself I didn't need credit. That impact mattered more than acknowledgement. That ego was loud, and I preferred quiet. But here's what no one tells you about normalized disrespect. It doesn't feel like disrespect at first. It feels like pragmatism, like maturity, like choosing peace, until one day you realize you're the only one making that choice. There were times I considered saying something, practicing the words in my head. I'd like to be included earlier. I think my role is being misunderstood. I don't feel my input is being taken seriously. But every version of that conversation ended the same way in my imagination, with someone explaining why it wasn't intentional, why did they value me, why I shouldn't take it that way. And I knew myself well enough to know that I'd leave that conversation doubting my own perception. Again. So instead, I stayed quiet. Silence became my coping mechanism, my way of staying professional, of avoiding being labeled difficult or emotional. I watched how quickly those labels stuck to others, how once applied, they colored every future interaction. I wasn't willing to wear them. What I didn't realize was that silence doesn't just protect you, it also educates people about how much they can get away with. They learned that I would adapt, that I would fill in gaps without complaint, that I would prioritize the collective outcome over my own positioning. And because I did it well, they stopped checking whether I was okay with it. I became the person who would always be there, no matter how decisions were made. The constant in a shifting environment. Useful, calm, unquestioning. At least that's how it looked from the outside. Inside, something was calcifying. Not anger, something colder. A kind of emotional compression. I began to detach slightly, not from my work, but from the hope that the system would eventually self-correct. I stopped expecting recognition to arrive organically. Instead, I observed. I noticed who spoke the loudest when uncertainty arose, who took credit easily, who deflected responsibility upward or downward with equal ease. I noticed how often certainty was confused for competence, and how rarely quiet accuracy was rewarded in the moment. And slowly, without announcing it to anyone, I made a private shift. If my role was going to remain invisible, then so would my intentions. I haven't changed my behavior yet. I didn't pull away. I didn't confront anyone. I just stopped assuming that staying quiet was the same thing as staying loyal. It wasn't something anyone ever said out loud. No one sat me down and explained the role they expected me to play. There was no memo, no formal shift in responsibilities. It emerged the way these things usually do, through repetition, assumption, and my own continued compliance. I was the stabilizer. When things were unclear, I clarified them. When people disagreed, I translated. When plans changed at the last minute, I absorbed the disruption. I became the person who made other people's decisions workable, even when those decisions ignored reality. And slowly, the role hardened. I wasn't invited to early discussions anymore, not because I was excluded, but because it was assumed I didn't need to be there until things were final. I was looped in once direction had been chosen, not while it was still forming. Evelyn will figure out how to make it work. That sentence followed me like a shadow. It was meant as praise, I know that, but it carried an unspoken expectation that I would contort myself, my time, my judgment, to fit decisions I didn't influence, that my job was not to shape outcomes, but to smooth their edges. I started to see how others positioned themselves in contrast. There were the visionaries, the ones who spoke in big arcs and bold statements. Their ideas were messy, sometimes impractical, but they were protected by confidence. If something failed, it was because the execution wasn't right. Then there were the communicators, the ones who narrated progress, reframed setbacks, and kept leadership reassured. They were always visible, always aligned with the story. And then there was I, the one who made sure deadlines were real, that contracts were honored, that dependencies were tracked, that nothing quietly exploded later. Essential, but not aspirational. I was assigned reliability the way others were assigned authority, and the more I fulfilled that role without protest, the more permanent it became. I noticed how often my workload increased without discussion, how responsibilities drifted toward me because I was good at handling details, how new initiatives quietly included an assumption that I would manage the complexity behind the scenes. When I raised concerns, they were acknowledged but rarely acted on. "We hear you. That's fair. Let's circle back." They were phrases designed to end discomfort, not resolve it. Over time, I stopped pushing for those conversations, not because I didn't care, but because I could predict the outcome. A temporary nod, followed by business as usual, and something subtle happened to my sense of self. I started editing my own expectations. I stopped imagining myself in roles that required visible authority. I told myself I preferred supporting others. That leadership didn't appeal to me, that I valued balance over ambition. Some of that was true, but not all of it. The part I didn't admit, even to myself, was that I had learned where my ceiling was. And that ceiling wasn't based on skill or insight. It was based on how others had categorized me: useful, dependable, safe, not disruptive, not demanding, not central. I watched newer voices enter the room, and be given more space simply because they spoke with certainty. I watched ideas less formed than mine be amplified because they came from someone already seen as influential. And still, I stayed because leaving felt drastic, because staying felt responsible, because I had built so much of my identity around being the one who held things together. I told myself that if I just kept doing excellent work, eventually the role would evolve. What I didn't see, at least not yet, was that the role was already fixed. They didn't see me as someone who needed to be convinced to stay. They saw me as part of the infrastructure, something stable, something that didn't require emotional investment or negotiation. And when you're seen that way, people stop checking whether you're still choosing to be there. They assume you are. That assumption created a quiet imbalance, one I felt every day but couldn't quite name, a sense that my presence was expected, but my perspective was optional. I wasn't angry, I was alert. Because once you realize the role you've been assigned, you have two options: continue performing it or decide privately whether you still consent. I hadn't made that decision yet, but I was getting closer. The day everything shifted didn't come with an argument. There was no confrontation, no sharp words, no moment where someone crossed an obvious line and forced my hand. It was quieter than that. It happened on a Friday afternoon, in a room half empty because most people had already mentally checked out for the weekend. We were reviewing a decision that had been finalized earlier that week, one I'd been looped into after the fact as usual. As the details were presented, I realized something immediately. The plan depended on a relationship I personally managed. A vendor who trusted me because I was consistent, honest, and careful with their constraints. The timeline assumed flexibility that didn't exist unless I made a very specific kind of request. No one asked me if that request was appropriate. No one even acknowledged that the relationship wasn't generic. It was personal, built over the years, maintained through mutual respect. They spoke about it as if access were automatic. I felt something then, not anger, not surprise, but a sudden unsettling clarity. They weren't just relying on my work anymore. They were relying on my goodwill, and they were doing it without asking. As the conversation continued, someone said, "Evelyn can handle the coordination on that side. She's great at keeping them flexible." I remember looking down at my notebook, the leather cover, the familiar weight of it in my hands. I didn't correct him. I didn't explain that flexible was a courtesy, not an obligation, that every time I asked for an exception, I spent relational capital. That trust, once strained, doesn't bounce back easily. I just nodded. But inside, something disengaged. For the first time, I saw the full picture. Not emotionally, but structurally. I saw how much of the system leaned on things that weren't documented, on relationships that existed because I maintained them, on quiet adjustments I made to protect decisions I hadn't influenced. And I realized something else, just as clearly. If I stopped doing those things, if I simply performed my role as it was formally defined, the system would wobble. Not collapse, not dramatically fail, but wobble enough to be noticed. That thought didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel calm, because it answered a question I hadn't known how to ask before. What am I actually choosing here? Up until that moment, I'd believed I was staying because I valued stability, because I cared about outcomes, because I didn't want to create a disruption. But standing there, listening to my relationships being spoken about like tools, I understood that I was also staying out of habit, out of a sense of responsibility that no one else seemed to share equally. The shift wasn't about deciding to leave. It was about realizing that I could, that my presence wasn't a moral obligation, that my silence wasn't neutrality, it was participation, that every time I smoothed over something quietly, I was reinforcing a system that benefited from my restraint without reciprocating respect. I finished the meeting the same way I always did. I summarized action items. I clarified the next steps. I thanked everyone and wished them a good weekend. No one noticed anything different. But that evening, sitting alone with a cup of tea gone cold, I opened my notebook and wrote something I'd never written before. Not a task, not a reminder, a question. What would happen if I stopped protecting people from the consequences of decisions they made without me? I didn't answer it that night. I didn't need to. The question itself was the shift. From that day on, I stopped framing my silence as patience. I stopped assuming that staying quiet meant staying aligned. I began to see restraint not as virtue, but as choice. and choices can be changed. I didn't become colder. I didn't pull away emotionally. I just stopped volunteering invisible labor. I followed the processes as written. I documented instead of smoothing. I asked for confirmation instead of fixing things quietly. I let timelines be realistic, even when they were inconvenient. And slowly, I felt something return to me. Not confidence, agency. I still hadn't decided to leave, not consciously, not yet, but the version of me who believed she had no alternative. That version was gone. And once that belief disappeared, everything else became possible. After that day, my silence changed texture. From the outside, nothing looked different. I still attended meetings, still responded to emails promptly, still did my job with the same level of care. If anyone had been asked, they would have said I was as reliable as ever. But internally, silence was no longer something that happened to me. It was something I chose. Before, I stayed quiet because I didn't want to disrupt, because I didn't want to be misunderstood, because I hoped that being reasonable would eventually be met with reciprocity. Now, I stayed quiet because I was listening strategically. I stopped filling in gaps mid-conversation. When someone made an assumption that was flawed, I didn't rush to correct it unless I was directly responsible for the outcome. When timelines were optimistic, I asked clarifying questions instead of quietly adjusting downstream. How would you like that handled, given the constraints? Can you confirm that expectation in writing? Who owns that decision? They were neutral questions, professional, hard to object to, and yet they subtly shifted the burden back where it belonged. At first, people didn't notice. Then they noticed, but misread it. I could feel the shift in how they spoke to me. A slight edge of confusion, occasional impatience. You're being very by the book lately. Let's not overcomplicate this. I thought you usually just handled these things. I smiled politely. I nodded. I didn't explain, because explaining would have turned my choice into a debate. And I wasn't interested in defending a boundary I hadn't announced. Silence, when chosen consciously, has a different weight. It creates space, and in that space, other people reveal themselves. I started seeing who relied on my unspoken interventions, who grew uncomfortable when asked to be precise, who preferred me to absorb uncertainty so they didn't have to. And I noticed something else. No one asked if I was okay. They asked if I was busy, if I had bandwidth, if I could help out the way I used to. Not once did anyone ask why I'd changed. That told me everything. They weren't concerned about me. They were concerned about access. The irony was that by doing less invisible work, I was actually doing my job more cleanly. There were fewer misunderstandings, more documentation, clearer ownership, but it felt uncomfortable for people who were used to ambiguity being quietly managed for them. I let that discomfort exist. This was the period when I heard the phrase that would later echo in my head. I think Evelyn's overreacting a bit. It was said lightly, not to my face. I found out because someone mentioned it offhand, thinking it was harmless. They think you're being a little intense about process lately, she said. But you know how they are. Overreacting. All I'd done was stop compensating. I didn't argue the label. I didn't rush to prove how calm I was. I didn't revert to old patterns to reassure anyone, because I recognized the word for what it was, a pressure mechanism. If they could frame my boundaries as emotional excess, they wouldn't have to examine why those boundaries were suddenly necessary, so I let them think it. I continued documenting decisions. I continued asking for clarity. I continued performing exactly what my role required, and no more. And slowly, I felt myself becoming less entangled. Their urgency stopped feeling like my emergency. Their last-minute changes stopped automatically becoming my problem. I wasn't withholding help out of spite. I was simply no longer preemptively fixing what I hadn't been included in. There's a difference. This was when the psychological reversal truly began, quietly, without announcement. The more I stopped explaining myself, the more they filled in the blanks with their own assumptions. She's checked out. She's being difficult. She's probably just stressed. None of them was true. I was clearer than I'd been in years. What they mistook for withdrawal was actually alignment with myself. And in that clarity, another realization formed. I didn't need to convince anyone of my value. I just needed to stop subsidizing a system that only worked because I was silent. For the first time, leaving wasn't an emotional fantasy or a dramatic escape. It was a logical possibility. And logic, once activated, doesn't go back to sleep. While they were busy interpreting my quiet as an attitude, something else was happening entirely. I was paying attention, not in a suspicious way, not with the intention to trap or expose anyone. I was simply observing the structure I'd been holding together for years, this time without cushioning it. I started documenting things I'd previously kept in my head, not emotionally charged notes, just facts, timelines, decision paths, dependencies, who approved what and when, what assumptions were made, and which risks were acknowledged or ignored. This wasn't about revenge, it was about accuracy. For years, I'd been the unofficial memory of the organization. I knew why things were done a certain way because I'd lived through the consequences of doing them differently. But that knowledge lived in me, not in any system. So I began transferring it, quietly. I organized files that had been scattered across inboxes. I updated process documents that hadn't been touched in years. I wrote summaries after meetings, not to control the narrative, but to make it explicit. Here's what was decided. Here's who owns it. Here's the risk we're accepting. People skimmed those emails at first. Some didn't respond at all. But documentation has a way of accumulating weight. At the same time, I began preparing myself, not emotionally, but practically. I updated my resume for the first time in years, not with urgency, with care. I articulated my experience without minimizing it. I named my contributions without apology. I reached out to former contacts, not to complain, not to hint, but to reconnect, to listen, to learn what else existed beyond the narrow role I'd been occupying. No one at work noticed. Why would they? I still showed up, still delivered, still solved the problems I was formally responsible for. What they didn't see was the internal reorganization. I stopped centering my identity around being needed. I started centering it around being accurate. I also began to notice how fragile some of the confidence around me actually was. How often were decisions made based on momentum, rather than understanding? How much depended on my quiet interventions I was no longer making automatically? Small cracks began to show. A vendor asked a question I used to preempt. A handoff was unclear because I hadn't rewritten it behind the scenes. A timeline slipped because no one had recalibrated expectations early. Nothing catastrophic, just friction. People started asking more questions, looping me in earlier, not out of respect, but necessity. Can you take a look at this? Does this seem right to you? What do you think the risk is? I answered honestly. Precisely, without cushioning. And then I stepped back. What they never noticed was how intentional all of this was. They assumed I was reacting emotionally, being rigid, pulling back, proving a point. I wasn't reacting. I was preparing. I learned what my work actually looked like when stripped of invisible labor. I learned which relationships were transactional and which were mutual. I learned where my influence truly was and where it wasn't. I also learned something about myself, that I didn't need chaos to justify leaving. I didn't need a villain. I didn't need to be wronged loudly. Clarity was enough. And in that clarity, I discovered leverage. Not the dramatic kind. Not secrets or scandals. Structural leverage. The kind that comes from being the connective tissue. From knowing where the bodies aren't buried, but where the processes quietly rely on human judgment rather than formal authority. I didn't exploit it. I respected it. Because leverage, when understood properly, doesn't need to be used aggressively. It simply needs to be acknowledged. I began to imagine what would happen if I removed myself cleanly. What knowledge would I leave with me? What assumptions would no longer hold, not with satisfaction, with neutrality? This wasn't about watching things fall apart. It was about recognizing that my presence had been compensating for gaps no one else felt responsible for closing. And that compensation had come at a cost. The more I saw, the less angry I felt. Anger implies surprise. This was acceptance. They never noticed the shift because it didn't look like a rebellion. It looked like professionalism. And that's the thing about quiet preparation. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't ask for permission. It just happens. By the time anyone realized something had changed, the groundwork would already be laid. I hadn't decided on a date yet. I hadn't said anything out loud. But I knew, with an unexpected sense of calm, that when I did leave, it wouldn't be impulsive. It would be irreversible. The reveal wasn't dramatic. There was no single document, no shocking discovery that made everything suddenly clear. It unfolded slowly through the accumulation of facts, patterns, and an understanding of my own position that I had avoided for years. What I realized privately was this: I wasn't just supporting the system, I was the system in several critical places. Not officially, not on paper, but functionally. Certain projects moved smoothly because I knew which corners could be cut and which absolutely could not. Certain partners stayed cooperative because I translated internal chaos into coherent communication. Certain risks never escalated because I intercepted them early, quietly, and without credit. And because none of that was visible, it was also unprotected. If I left, there was no clear succession, no documented owner for half the things I handled by instinct, no shared understanding of why certain practices existed. That knowledge wasn't leveraged in the sense of power over others. It was leverage in the sense of choice. For the first time, I understood that staying wasn't neutral. It was a decision with consequences. And so was leaving. I tested this understanding carefully. I took a week of vacation and did something I'd never done before. I didn't pre-solve anything. I left thorough documentation, clear handoffs, no hidden fixes. When I returned, I was met with relief and confusion. Things hadn't collapsed. But they hadn't flowed either. People had followed instructions. But without the context that lived only in me, they made choices that were technically correct and strategically off. I answered questions when asked. I clarified. But I didn't absorb the responsibility for outcomes that weren't mine to own. That week confirmed what I already suspected. My value wasn't just in what I did, it was in what I prevented. And prevention is invisible until it stops. The second part of the reveal was more personal. I realized how much of myself I had been editing to remain palatable, how often I'd chosen restraint over expression, not out of wisdom, but out of fear of being dismissed, how deeply I'd internalized the idea that wanting more space, more influence, more acknowledgement was somehow indulgent. I wasn't burned out from the work. I was burned out from being unrecognized while being essential. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me honest. With myself first. I stopped asking whether I was overreacting. I stopped measuring my discomfort against other people's intentions. I stopped waiting for validation that would never arrive in the form I needed. Instead, I asked a simpler question. Is this sustainable for me? The answer was no. Not because it was unbearable, but because it was stagnant. Staying meant continuing to trade clarity for comfort. Leaving meant uncertainty, but also integrity. Once I saw that trade-off clearly, the emotional fog lifted. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt still. The private reveal wasn't about discovering how much power I had. It was about discovering how much I'd been giving away, quietly, consistently, and without consent. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. I began to think seriously about timing, about how to leave in a way that was clean, ethical, aligned with my values. I didn't want to shock anyone. I didn't want to burn bridges. I didn't want to punish. I just wanted to stop participating in a dynamic that required my self-erasure to function. I planned carefully. I gave myself options. I made sure my next step wasn't reactive. And through all of this, I told no one. Not because it was a secret, but because it didn't need witnesses. This decision belonged to me. The reveal stayed private because it wasn't meant to change how they saw me. It was meant to change how I saw myself. And once that changed, the rest was logistics. There's a moment when you've seen enough where staying becomes an active choice rather than a default. That was where I stood. I hadn't resigned yet. I hadn't told anyone I was considering it. On the surface, everything still looked stable. But internally, the balance had shifted. Every day I stayed, I felt the weight of that decision more clearly. I gave myself time, not to hesitate, but to be precise. I laid out the options the way I would for any complex problem. I could stay and try to renegotiate my role, ask for clearer authority, advocate for earlier inclusion, risk being labeled difficult, or worse, tolerated but unchanged. I could stay and disengage emotionally, do the work, collect the paycheck, stop caring about outcomes, preserve stability at the cost of integrity, or I could leave, not in protest, not with a list of grievances, just leave. Each option had consequences. I didn't romanticize any of them. The first required a level of institutional willingness I had no evidence for. Every attempt at subtle course correction had been met with reassurance, not restructuring. I knew how that conversation would go. I also knew how it would end. with me being asked to be patient, flexible, and understanding. I'd done that already. The second option felt tempting on bad days. Detachment can feel like relief. But I knew myself well enough to know that sustained disengagement would hollow me out. I didn't want to become someone who stayed physically present but emotionally absent. That kind of quiet resignation leaves a residue. The third option, leaving, was irreversible. Once I stepped away, I couldn't undo it. The system would adapt. People would reinterpret the past. The narrative wouldn't be mine to control. That was the risk. And yet, it was the only option that didn't require me to keep shrinking. I didn't arrive at the decision in a rush. There was no surge of adrenaline, no late-night impulse. It settled in slowly, like a conclusion I'd already reached but hadn't named yet. One morning, sitting at my desk before anyone else arrived, I realized I was no longer asking if I would leave. I was asking how. That was the decision point. Not an emotional peak, but a cognitive one. I felt an unexpected sense of calm, the kind that comes when uncertainty collapses into clarity. I wasn't excited. I wasn't afraid. I was resolved. From that moment on, my energy shifted from analysis to execution. I stopped mentally rehearsing conversations that would never happen. I stopped scanning for signs that things might improve. I started planning an exit that aligned with my values. I would give proper notice. I would leave my documentation clean. I would not weaponize my knowledge. I would not make my departure a referendum on anyone else's behavior. I would leave without arguing. That part mattered to me, because arguing would have pulled me back into a dynamic where my experience had to be validated externally, where my reasons could be debated, minimized, or reframed. I wasn't interested in that anymore. I didn't need them to agree that I was right. I just needed to be done. I drafted my resignation letter several times, not because I couldn't find the words, but because I wanted them to be exact, simple, factual, kind. No accusations, no emotional subtext, no invitations for negotiation. Each draft got shorter. In the end, the letter said less than I'd once imagined it would. That felt right. The finality of the decision didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel aligned, as if a long internal argument had finally ended. Not because someone won, but because I stopped participating. There was grief in that, of course, for the version of myself who'd hoped things would change, for the energy I'd invested in believing that quiet consistency would eventually be recognized. But there was also relief, because the moment you choose the irreversible option, the noise quiets. You stop explaining things, to yourself most of all. And once that happens, the next steps aren't dramatic. They're just steps. Once the decision was made, I became very quiet. Not withdrawn, not cold, efficient. There's a difference between secrecy and privacy. What I was doing fell firmly into the second category. I didn't owe anyone a preview of my exit, and I wasn't interested in managing reactions before there was something concrete to react to. So I moved in silence. I finalized my next role carefully, making sure it aligned with what I'd learned about myself, not just professionally, but psychologically. I chose an environment where clarity was valued, where process wasn't treated as friction, where calm competence wasn't mistaken for passivity. I didn't announce this to anyone. At work, I continued exactly as before. I met deadlines. I attended meetings. I responded thoughtfully. If anything, I was more composed, because the internal tension that had been draining me was gone. People sensed the calm, but misread it. "You seem lighter," someone said. "Have you been on vacation?" Another joked. I smiled and said nothing. Behind the scenes, I prepared cleanly. I organized documentation so that it could stand without me. I made sure handoffs were clear, not to soften the impact of my departure, but to ensure I left with integrity. I wasn't trying to create chaos. I was trying to exit without leaving a mess. I declined to take on new long-term initiatives. When asked why, I framed it as capacity management. True, but incomplete. I stopped volunteering for things that required future ownership. I redirected questions to the appropriate decision makers. I made sure my name wasn't attached to outcomes I wouldn't be there to see. No one challenged this. Why would they? It all looked reasonable, responsible, even. That's the thing about moving in silence. It doesn't trigger alarms. It doesn't invite resistance. People don't brace for what they don't see coming. I also prepared emotionally. I let go of the need to be understood. I imagined how my departure might be reframed, as sudden, as unexpected, as unfortunate but manageable. I accepted that my reasons would be speculated about, simplified, maybe even dismissed. That was part of the cost, and I was willing to pay it. The night before I planned to submit my resignation, I didn't feel nervous. I felt clear. I reread the letter one last time, not to adjust it, but to make sure it still reflected the truth without excess. It did. The next morning, I sent it. No preamble, no scheduling of a quick chat, just a respectful note, offering notice and support during the transition. Then I closed my laptop and went for a walk. That was the moment I noticed how different this felt from how I'd imagined leaving in the past. There was no spike of adrenaline, no urge to check my email obsessively, just space. When I returned, there was a response waiting. Polite, surprised, asking if we could talk. Of course we could. But the terms had changed. I wasn't entering that conversation to negotiate. I wasn't there to justify myself. I wasn't seeking validation or closure. I was simply informing them of a decision already made. And that distinction changed everything. The meeting that followed was calm, questions were asked, reassurances were offered. I listened, nodded, and thanked them for the opportunities. I didn't argue. I didn't list grievances. I didn't explain how many times I'd been dismissed or how often I'd been told I was overreacting for wanting clarity. Because once you've chosen to leave, explanations are optional. Silence again was a choice. I gave my notice. I confirmed my last day. I agreed on a transition plan, and then I went back to my desk and finished my work. Around me, everything continued as normal. People joked, meetings happened, deadlines loomed. No one fully grasped what was in motion yet, but I could feel it. The quiet dominance of knowing that I had already stepped out of the dynamic, emotionally, psychologically, even while I was still physically present. I had left without arguing long before I actually left. The first consequences didn't arrive with drama. They arrived in confusion. At first, it showed up in small, almost comical ways. Questions that had simple answers. Answers I used to provide without being asked began circulating in group chats. Emails went back and forth longer than necessary. Meetings ended with "let's follow up on that" instead of decisions. No one connected it to me. Why would they? I was still there, still responding, still professional, but I was no longer compensating. People began to feel the absence of something they couldn't name, a kind of friction they hadn't felt before, because it had always been absorbed quietly. I watched this with a strange detachment. Not satisfaction, more like confirmation. This was what the system looked like without my invisible labor. A project stalled because two departments had different assumptions about ownership. I'd flagged that risk months ago, but this time I didn't step in early. The issue surfaced in real time, in front of everyone. Someone said, "Why didn't we catch this sooner?" No one looked at me. Another situation unfolded with a vendor who pushed back on a request that used to be handled delicately. Without the relational context I normally provided, the communication turned rigid, tense, formal. The vendor didn't break the contract, but they stopped bending. And suddenly, timelines became less flexible, costs more fixed. People noticed that. There were side conversations, quiet recalibrations, a sense that things were taking more effort than they used to. Still, no one said my name out loud. What they felt was loss without attribution. And that's how it often begins. A manager asked me casually, "Have things felt harder lately, or is it just me?" I answered honestly, "There's been a lot of complexity lately." Not a lie, not the whole truth either. During my notice period, I stuck to the transition plan exactly. I answered questions. I pointed people to the documentation. I made myself available during working hours. I didn't stay late. I didn't jump in to rescue things at the last minute. Some people seemed unsettled by that. "You don't have to worry about this after you leave," someone joked. I smiled. That's true. It wasn't a threat, just a fact. As my last day approached, the atmosphere shifted. The quiet assumption that I'd always be there was finally cracking. People began to realize how much I'd been holding together, not through a grand reveal, but through accumulation. "Oh, you're the one who usually handles that. Wait, who's taking over this?" "I didn't realize you were involved in so many of these processes," I answered politely. Redirected where I could. Let silence do the rest. There was no moment where someone said, "We made a mistake." There didn't need to be. The consequences weren't punishment. They were exposed. exposure of gaps, of assumptions, of how much had been leaning on one person's restraint. Some tried to accelerate knowledge transfer in the final days, urgent meetings, requests for just one more walkthrough. I complied within reason, but I didn't compress years of context into a week. I didn't resurrect the invisible safety net I'd dismantled. Not out of spite, out of honesty, because pretending everything could be smoothly transferred would have been another form of erasure, this time of my own experience. On my last afternoon, I packed my desk slowly. The notebook, the small plant I'd kept alive longer than some initiatives, a few personal items no one had ever commented on. People stopped by to say goodbye. Most were kind, some were awkward, a few said, "I didn't realize how much you did until now." I thanked them. What I didn't do was reassure them that everything would be fine, because maybe it wouldn't be, and that was okay. The consequences had begun, not as chaos, but as awareness. And awareness, once triggered, doesn't disappear. I walked out that day feeling lighter, not because I'd proven anything, but because I'd finally stopped carrying what wasn't mine. There's a particular kind of panic that doesn't look like urgency at first. It looks like a realization. That was what began to ripple through the weeks after I left. At first, there were polite check-ins, clarifying emails, questions framed as follow-ups to the transition plan. I responded to what I'd agreed to respond to. Nothing more, nothing less. Then the tone shifted. Messages became longer, more detailed, less certain. People began looping in others, as if hoping that additional eyes might conjure answers that weren't there. What they were really doing was trying to rebuild context. And context, once gone, is hard to recreate. I heard about it indirectly, through former colleagues who reached out just to catch up, through neutral observations slipped into casual conversation. "It's been interesting since you left. We didn't realize how much you were coordinating. Things are fine but slower." Slower was the polite word. What they meant was fragmented. Decisions that used to move smoothly now stall in clarification loops. Small issues escalated because no one felt confident enough to resolve them quietly. Relationships that had been managed through trust were now governed strictly by contract. Nothing was broken, but nothing flowed. That's the stage where organizations usually try to fix things retroactively. I could see the attempts from a distance. Roles were redefined, titles adjusted, meetings added. People who had once spoken broadly were now being asked to get specific, and some of them struggled with that. There was talk of process gaps, of unexpected complexity, of knowledge silos. No one said my name in those discussions. They didn't have to. The more pressure built, the more someone eventually reached out directly. Not confrontational, not apologetic, just hopeful. "Would you be open to consulting on a few things? Even just temporarily? We'd really value your perspective." I read the message carefully. This was the moment where things could have gone differently. I could have stepped back in, framed it as support, helped them stabilize, reclaim some sense of importance. But that would have required re-entering the dynamic I'd left, where my value was recognized only in absence, only when things became difficult. I declined politely, not emotionally, not defensively. "I don't think I'm the right person for that," I wrote. "I wish you the best in finding a solution." It was true. The panic that followed wasn't loud. It manifested as urgency disguised as opportunity. More messages, more proposals, subtle hints that my leaving had been a loss. But here's the thing about timing. By the time people realize they need to change how they treat someone, that person has usually already changed how they treat themselves. It wasn't that they couldn't fix things, it was that they were trying to fix them, after the moment when listening would have mattered. The system could be patched, processes documented, new people trained. But the dynamic, the one where my silence had been mistaken for consent, that was already over. And I had no interest in resurrecting it. I noticed something else too. No one asked why I left. Not really. They asked how things were done, where things lived, what I'd recommend, but not why I had chosen to go. Because asking that question would have required acknowledging that this wasn't a sudden departure, that there had been signals, that my leaving was a response, not a surprise. It was easier to frame it as unfortunate timing, as a skills gap, as bad luck. By the time any real reflection might have happened, it was too late. Not because bridges were burned, but because I was already somewhere else, building something that didn't require me to disappear to function. I didn't feel smug about this. I felt finished. There's a difference. Closure didn't come from watching others struggle. It came from refusing to re-enter a space where my presence had been taken for granted. I didn't owe them my return to validate my departure, and I didn't owe myself the burden of being the solution one more time. Some doors don't close with a slam, they close quietly after being left open too long. And once they're closed, knocking doesn't mean they'll open again. The confrontation, when it finally happened, didn't look like one. There was no raised voice, no dramatic revelation, no emotional exchange designed to settle scores. It came in the form of a coffee. A former manager reached out, suggesting we meet just to talk. No agenda, no urgency. I agreed, mostly out of curiosity, not about them, but about myself. I wanted to see how it would feel to be in that space again without the weight I used to carry. We sat by the window of a quiet cafe. Neutral territory. Comfortable silence. They thanked me for coming, asked how I was settling into my new role. I answered honestly, but briefly. I didn't oversell it, I didn't compare. Then they leaned back and said something carefully phrased. In hindsight, I think there were things we could have done differently. It wasn't an apology, not exactly. It was an opening. I didn't rush to fill it. Silence has a way of clarifying intent. After a moment, they continued. They spoke about how my departure had revealed gaps, how certain responsibilities had been underestimated, how they hadn't realized how much context lived with me. I listened, not with resentment, with detachment. They asked eventually, "Was there something specific that made you decide to leave?" That was the closest thing to a confrontation. I considered my answer. I could have listed moments, replayed meetings, explained how often I'd been dismissed, how frequently I'd been told, directly or indirectly, that I was overreacting for wanting clarity or inclusion. But doing that would have turned the conversation into a defense, and I didn't need to defend my leaving, so I chose the truth, without heat. I realized I was adjusting myself to fit a role that didn't have room to grow, I said, and I didn't want to keep doing that. They nodded slowly. There was a pause, a longer one this time. "I wish you'd said something earlier," they said. I met their eyes. "I did," I replied, not sharply, not accusingly, just not loudly. That landed. I didn't elaborate. I didn't need to. The rest of the conversation stayed calm, reflective, almost gentle. There were no promises made, no requests for me to return. Just an unspoken understanding settling into place. This wasn't about closure in the cinematic sense. It was about mutual recognition. Arriving late, but arriving nonetheless. When we stood to leave, they said, "I hope you know your work mattered." I smiled genuinely. "I know, Sadiki," I said. "I just needed it to matter while I was there." We parted without awkwardness. No bitterness, no unresolved tension. Walking away, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, relief. Because the confrontation I'd imagined for years, the one where I'd finally be heard, had turned out to be unnecessary. I didn't need them to fully understand my experience for it to be valid. I didn't need an apology to justify my choice. I had already given myself what I needed by leaving. And that, I realized, was the quiet power in all of this. Not that they eventually saw, but I stopped waiting for them to. Who I am now is not a louder version of who I was. I didn't reinvent myself. I didn't harden. I didn't swing to the opposite extreme and become someone unrecognizable. What changed wasn't my personality. It was my position, internally. I still move through rooms quietly. I still listen more than I speak. I still value precision over performance, but now I no longer confuse restraint with self-erasure. In my new role, I'm not the loudest voice in the meeting. I don't need to be. The difference is that when I speak, the room pauses. Not because I demand it, but because I'm expected to contribute at that level. That expectation is everything. I'm included early, not out of courtesy, but because my perspective is understood to shape outcomes. When I raise concerns, they're examined, not minimized. When I say something won't work, it's treated as information, not resistance. And when I stay silent, no one assumes it means compliance. That's the shift. I don't over-explain anymore. I don't preemptively soften my words to make them easier to digest. I don't volunteer invisible labor as a way to earn belonging. I offer what's mine to offer, clearly, intentionally, and I stop there. What surprises me most is how much lighter that feels. Not because the work is easier, but because my energy is no longer split between doing the job and managing how I'm perceived while doing it. There's no constant internal negotiation, no silent tally of how much I'm giving versus how much space I'm allowed. I no longer mistake being needed for being valued. Outside of work, the change echoes in quieter ways. I notice when conversations become one-sided, and I don't rush to rebalance them. I notice when my absence creates space, and I let it. I don't chase alignment that requires me to shrink. Some relationships adjusted naturally, others faded. I didn't dramatize that either. I've learned that not every ending needs a conversation. Some dynamics dissolve once you stop performing the role they depended on. I'm not bitter about the past. That's important to say. I don't look back with resentment or regret. I understand now that I participated in that version of my life. I stayed silent longer than I should have, not because I was weak, but because I believed patience would be met with awareness. It wasn't. But that doesn't make the patience foolish. It makes it complete. What I carry forward isn't armor, it's discernment. I know now that calm does not mean compliant. That professionalism does not require self-abandonment. That leaving can be an act of integrity, not failure. And perhaps most importantly, I know that my value doesn't increase when I explain it more clearly. It increases when I place it where it's recognized. I don't need to dominate rooms to have authority. I don't need to argue to be decisive. I don't need to react loudly to prove I've been wronged. I react by choosing differently. That's who I am now, not invisible, not hardened, not waiting, just present on my own terms. There's a story we're often told about strength. That's loud, that it announces itself. It looks like confrontation or endurance, or the ability to stay and withstand more than others. I believed that story for a long time. I believed that if I stayed calm, reasonable, and capable long enough, the system around me would eventually adjust, that people would notice what I carried, that fairness would emerge organically without me having to name it. What I learned instead is this: systems don't change just because someone is quietly holding them together. They change when that support is no longer guaranteed. That doesn't make leaving a threat. It makes the information. I didn't leave to teach anyone a lesson. I didn't leave to be missed. I didn't leave to watch consequences unfold from a distance. I left because staying required me to keep editing myself in ways that were no longer honest. And I left without arguing, not because there was nothing to say, but because I'd already said it in every way that mattered, through consistency, through restraint, through the boundaries I eventually chose not to cross anymore. When people told me I was overreacting, I didn't react louder. I reacted by leaving. That choice wasn't dramatic. It didn't make headlines. It didn't come with instant validation, but it restored something essential: alignment. Alignment between what I value and how I live, between what I contribute and how it's received, between who I am and the space I occupy. If there's a moral here, it's not that everyone should walk away the moment they feel overlooked. It's this: pay attention to what your silence is buying you and what it's costing. Silence can be wisdom. It can also be labor. And labor, when unpaid and unacknowledged, eventually becomes unsustainable. Leaving doesn't always mean failure. Sometimes it's the most respectful thing you can do, for yourself and for the truth of the situation. Not every environment deserves your adaptability. Not every dynamic improves with more patience. Some only reveal themselves when you stop compensating. If you're listening to this and recognizing pieces of yourself, if you've ever been the reliable one, the calm one, the one who smooths things over while slowly disappearing, I want you to know this: you're not imagining it. And you're not wrong for wanting more clarity, more respect, more room. You don't have to explode to be justified. You don't have to convince anyone to leave. Sometimes the most powerful response is the quietest one. So I'll leave you with a question, not to provoke, but to reflect. Have you ever stayed silent in a place that slowly taught you to disappear? And what might change if you stopped?